Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from beautiful Florida. And today I thought we would continue our tour of the library, and we are currently in the art section, and particularly in the costume section, which is here. And for those who are not familiar, I am a devotee of the history of costume and dress, and if you're familiar with me as an artist, I think that you will see this. And it's been a passion of mine for many years, so I have many books on the subject. And today I wanted to share two of them with you. And I realize that if you're watching this channel, you may very well not be a student of historical costume, but by the same token, you might be, because many people who are interested in metaphysics are also interested in history and not infrequently interested in costume. But even if you're not, bear with me, you may find it interesting. And I have three books to share with you today. And the first is called What People Wore by Douglas Gorsline, and it is from Bonanza Books. It was published, I believe, 1976, and I got it not too long after. And I got it through the history book club that I used to belong to. And in those days, there weren't necessarily bookstores near where you lived if you were not in a major city, or if there were, they had a very limited selection. So people who were devotees of unusual subjects, or I guess history isn't really an unusual subject, but it wasn't necessarily in the local bookstore. And so these clubs existed to serve that audience, and I got many books from the History Book Club and other similar clubs in the late 70s, many of which are still here in the collection. What is interesting about this book? Well, it is a survey of historical costume, beginning in ancient history and moving up all the way through the 20th century. And as you can see, it's illustrated with hand-drawn line drawings. And it is very detailed, very thorough as a survey of costume, but the thing that I particularly like are in fact the line drawings, because they show a great deal of detail. And today you can easily find photos of historical garments and all kinds of materials online. But with something like this, where it has been rendered in a line drawing, sometimes the detail is easier to pick out and understand, particularly because there's also quite a bit of commentary with this book explaining the drawings. And it shows you, I think, in a detail that is very admirable, very detailed, what these costumes were like. And as you can see, it covers all kinds of different eras and areas. And again, the drawings are very detailed, and in some cases it's easier to tell what you're looking at than in the original painting, and sometimes even than looking at the original garment. So I like the line drawings for that reason. Another thing that's very interesting about this book is that most of these drawings are based on famous paintings or famous photographs. Some not so famous, but in many cases there are people here who are important in history. For example, here is Mary Todd Lincoln, and the famous photo of her in her ball gown, and many other historical people who are reproduced in these line drawings in their costume, and it's very interesting. It is an interesting look at the costumes of the past in a way that is very detailed for understanding in the present, so I recommend this book highly. Now, the next book I want to recommend is kind of in the same vein. It's called Costumes and Styles by Henry Harald Hansen. It was published in 1956. And as you can see from the cover, it is illustrated, again, with original artwork depicting the costumes that are being discussed and the eras that are being discussed. And the thing about this book is that it represents the artwork of the period in the style of the period. And all of the illustrations are taken from famous or not so famous paintings, illustrations, etc. And if you're a student of the history of art, you'll recognize many of them. Not all of them by any means, and some of the artwork I believe is original where suitable inspiration could not be found, but here in the 20th century part you'll see artwork based on famous photos, as well as less famous photos, magazine illustrations, etc. But what's interesting about this is that, again, the artwork makes the detail of the costumes very clear, and the fact that it's reproduced in the original style gives you a sense of how the people wanted to see themselves, how they perceived themselves as looking, not just how they looked. And I think that's very insightful to understanding where they were and why they chose the costumes they chose. So I highly recommend this book as well. It's actually one of my favorites. Probably my favorite of all my costume books. And then the last book we're going to look at is Everyday Dress, 1650 to 1900 by Elizabeth Ewing. And this has basically discussion and illustration of everyday clothing of everyday people. Obviously, when you study costume, when you study fashion, most of what you're going to see are wealthy and famous people because most of the illustrations, paintings, photographs, etc. depict what they were wearing. But there's a lot of information about what ordinary people wore as well. But getting good books or other material on the subject is not so easy. This book talks about what everyday people wore in their everyday lives, and also such things as professional dress for different lines of work that you would not necessarily imagine if you were not familiar with it, based on the more fashionable outline of the history of costume, because ordinary people did not necessarily dress that way. So I highly recommend this, and it is from Chelsea House Publishers, and was published originally in 1984. And I don't know if you can still get it, but I highly recommend it, and I'm sure you could find it, even if it's not still in print. So those are the three books I'd like to recommend to you today, and if you're a student of historical costume, I think you'd find them very interesting. And even if you're not, I hope you still found them interesting, and until tomorrow, may you blessed be. The Tarot of Hecate. My 100-card tarot deck, 30 years in the making, finally available to you from witchschoolstore.com. Check out a copy today.